Well, yes, good evening. So I'm actually a historian at the University of Southampton, so I hope you can have some sympathy for me here, that the idea of facing the future is kind of the opposite of what I generally do for my trade. But what I wanted to look at here was actually facing our future with our ongoing conflict with Islamic extremism, what is generally referred to as the war on terror, and really look at a question of how and when does this end? Academic colleagues, commentators, those within the organizations involved in this conflict themselves have spent a lot of time debating when this actually began. Did it begin in the September 11 attacks and George Bush's declaration of a war on terror? Did it begin with Osama bin Laden's declaration of a jihad against the United States and the West in 1996? Or maybe with the formation of Al-Qaeda in 1998? If you asked a member of Al-Qaeda, they would actually tell you this is a 1,000-year conflict, that this conflict started in the 11th century with Western Crusader knights invading Islamic territory. But nowhere near as much time has been spent trying to answer the question, when does it actually end? What I would say is this conflict is actually at a junction at this point. There's a mainstream approach to how this conflict goes on, and there is an alternative. The mainstream approach, to give you some idea of, is that we are entering a new phase of the war on terror. What former Defense Secretary Leon Panetta described as a new direction. And Bruce Riedel, a very key advisor to Barack Obama, has labeled Al-Qaeda 3.0, perhaps the most dangerous version of Al-Qaeda yet. And what our own Prime Minister described as a generational struggle in Africa, only a month ago in Parliament. Now, to give you some background on where Al-Qaeda 3.0 comes from, Al-Qaeda 1 is probably the Al-Qaeda you recognize the most. This is the Al-Qaeda based in Afghanistan with Osama bin Laden at its head, a very hierarchical organization that planned and undertook the September 11th attacks. And that organization was all but destroyed with the NATO invasion of Afghanistan following 9/11. But with America's shift of interest to Iraq, a country not involved in the 9/11 attacks, Al-Qaeda was able to rebuild itself, breathe new life into that movement when the United States had it on the ropes. And actually it relaunched itself as what has been labeled Al-Qaeda 2.0, a franchise operation where a hard core of some 200 Islamic militants with a history dating back to the 1980s of guerrilla tactics and terror-style attacks sold those skills to Islamic militant groups around the world. Groups like Al-Shabaab in Somalia and Boko Haram in Nigeria. But since 2009, when Osama bin Laden was very much put to the sidelines of these organizations, the Obama administration used controversial tactics of unmanned drones and special forces strikes to very much decapitate or aim to decapitate these franchise operations by destroying the leaders. And very much successfully so. Figures indicate that around about half of that original hardcore of some 200 Arab militants have been killed since Barack Obama came to the White House. The final nail in the coffin seemed to be the Arab Spring, which suggested to the world that actually violence and terrorism was not the best way to bring about change in Arab nations, as groups like Al-Qaeda had believed, but that actually near spontaneous people power protests could bring change. Tunisia and Egypt were the most lauded of these, and then military confrontation in Libya resulting in Gaddafi being ousted as well. However, it's this very liberation that people like Riedel have said have led to this new form of Al-Qaeda. That the chaos left behind by these protests has meant that places like Libya and the civil war that now rages in Syria have become incubators for a new kind of Al-Qaeda. That Al-Qaeda members have traveled to these places to learn new skills, to meet and to recruit, and to once again form a third wave of Islamic terrorism. And according to Riedel and Cameron, it's these groups that are responsible for the attacks we might recognize in places like Algeria, at the beginning of this year, the killing of 4 Americans in Benghazi on the anniversary of September 11th last year, and the militants that have seized large swathes of territory in Mali, currently in conflict with the French forces. However, I would challenge this mainstream thinking in this case. And I would ask a question: at what point in something's evolution does it cease to be what it originally was? At what point in this war on terror does Al-Qaeda cease to be the Al-Qaeda we recognize it as, and recognize it as something different? I would say what is happening in North Africa is that different moment. Because if we look at what's happening, if we look at the membership and we look at the groups, then in their most basic form, those groups seem very familiar. At the top, we have franchise operations with a tiny minority of hardcore Arab Islamic extremists who pass on their skills and their training to African militant groups. But if we actually look at the grievances of these groups, if we actually look at what they're fighting for and how they are recruited and where they come from, there are significant differences to the Al-Qaeda that launched the 9/11 attacks and began the war on terror. These groups actually share many common characteristics and grievances, but they are not those of the original Al-Qaeda. A hatred of the Western presence in Arab lands, a hatred of Western exploitation of Middle Eastern oil supplies, and a hatred of Israel. These groups actually have very different core grievances. And those grievances tend to be much more common to things we wouldn't necessarily relate to terrorist groups. Those differences actually are in climate change and their corrupt and ineffective governments in the lands that these militants come from. And the reason for that is that the area these militants are being recruited from, known as the Sahel, a predominantly Muslim area of North Africa, has been called by the United Nations ground zero for climate change. On this map, the areas marked red are areas with 0 days of arable farming. This is Somalia, Mali, Algeria. Not just the farming, but also unprecedented rises in temperature, unprecedented drops in rainfall, and the most frequent flash floods of the highest category anywhere in the world. Now, the impact of this on the people of the Sahel is that their livelihoods are being destroyed. People that farm, that fish, that herd animals, these people are being forced to migrate as environmental refugees, desperately looking for some way to sustain their lives. That migration is predominantly down into Central Africa, an area which brings them into conflict with Christian groups across that land, creating tension and conflict in that region. But not just that. What escalates this tension and conflict further is the fact that this migration is taking place in territory that has a huge availability of small arms and light weapons. This tension is coming out in the form of these groups becoming Islamic militants. Now, typically in these sort of situations, we would perhaps expect that the government might have something to do with this. But the government of these regions is largely corrupt and ineffective. Not because of poverty, because under the Sahel are huge energy supplies. The Sahel has an abundance of oil and natural gases, and these governments are not poor. The governments of Nigeria and Chad get billions of dollars of revenue every single year from energy providers like BP. But that money goes straight to corrupt governments. There is no check on how those governments use it. These providers are not held to account how that money is being spent. And these governments fail to safeguard the basic requirements of their citizens. Clean water, food, arable land. In fact, the very thing they sell for the huge revenue is the very thing making their citizens environmental refugees. Without any government support and with very little international community support, those refugees turn to the one area they have left, the mosques. But the mosques in their region are not traditional mosques. They are not teaching traditional Islam. These mosques are set up and funded by extremist groups from Arab lands, predominantly Saudi Arabia. And in these mosques, they exploit the religion of the people of the Sahel to tell a simple story where the way to get their lives back and to be secure is to drive out Western influence, to topple their governments, and to return to a literal version of the Quran, 7th century Islam, like the kind that we recognize the Taliban forcing upon the people of Afghanistan. This is where Al-Qaeda 3.0 is recruiting and comes from. This is who French warplanes are killing. This is who our Prime Minister promises to the very corrupt governments the weapons and the training to fight and to combat. These people, desperate environmental refugees exploited by a tiny minority of radical extremist Muslims. So I said we were at a split point, a junction. And our choices really are that we can look at the war on terror as a perpetual conflict in which we just kill each militant group that rises up, irrespective of the root causes of why they are doing it. And we can kill our way out of this, but it certainly doesn't end. We just accept that this is how we conduct our affairs, and that when people clash up against the evils of capitalism and the global damage that capitalism might cause, we confront them with armed forces, or we train the governments in the countries that they are rising up to suppress them. Alternatively, we can make the harder choice, and we can actually try to combat this. We can try to do something about the root causes of Al-Qaeda 3.0, which is not the charismatic leadership of bin Laden, which is not grievances in the Arab lands, but climate change. Ground zero for climate change. And so, really, the single idea of this talk is that we need to realize that we are sold a false dichotomy. We are sold a view where we must make a choice between our national security, which we defend with military force, or investing in green energies and climate change. That one thing is for the military and that whole section of the budget, and the other thing is for aid and development and NGOs and the United Nations to deal with. The reality is, climate change and the security of all humans in areas affected by it directly affects our national security. This is not a binary choice. I am not an environmental campaigner. I am a terrorism researcher. I am saying these two meet. There is a complete divergence. Our interests in protecting this nation lie in combating climate change. And you might ask, well, what can I do about this? Especially the students in the room might be thinking, well, how can I have any influence on something so huge? And the first thing I'd say is, you've already made a good step by spending a Friday night somewhere like this. This means you're curious, you're scholarly, you're open-minded, you want to hear new ideas. But I'm, like I said, not an environmental campaigner. There are people 1,000 times more qualified than me that can tell you how you can affect the climate change part of this. But what I would say is, as you face your future, as you decide what you want to do for a degree, as you decide what you want to do for a job, keep in mind one thing. Are you doing things to make this problem worse, or are you trying to combat it? Every time you are forced to make a tough decision, what course to study, what to do for a job, what position to hold, what decision to make in a business place, whatever job it might be you go on to do, a lawyer, a politician, a CEO in a company, a worker in a company, a commuter, whatever choices you are forced to make, think to yourself, am I doing something to make this problem better, or am I doing something to make it worse? And ultimately, if at the end of the day, above all other interests, making money, gaining influence, being happy, you consider the security and welfare of other human beings, I would say that's you doing your part. That is how we end the war on terror. We accept that this is not a conflict that is just about Islam versus the West. This is not a conflict that is just them and us, a hardcore evil terrorist group that hate us for our freedoms, but actually desperate people on the sharp edge of capitalism, protesting against it in any way they can. And if we do our best to make sure that we don't put those people in those positions, the recruiting base for groups like Al-Qaeda, who rely upon desperation and hatred, will dry up much more quickly than we could possibly kill it. Thank you very much for listening.